So sorry, I'm sitting there thinking, oh, it'll be here in a minute. It'll be here in a minute. Right, I'll hang up. Okay. Bye. Hello, I'm sorry about that. Right, shall I kick off? Just waiting to see if is Jackie there?
Sorry, I keep muting myself unintentionally. Yeah, apologies about that. We had a little.
No, it's my fault clicking on the wrong blooming one. I thought I was really early as well. I was thinking, oh, I'm nice and set up now. Never mind.
So sorry.
Don't worry, we're here now. That's okay.
We have all our participants here.
I'm so sorry for keeping you all waiting. Right, let me just share my screen. So I think I can't see a something that says I haven't got the tools thing, Jackie, that I had last time that enables me to share my screen. Ah, there we go. Right, tools. Thank you. So let me just kick this off and then we will definitely get going. Right. Screen to share. Great. Oh, so apologies for that. As I say, I was sitting there for about the last 15 minutes waiting for you all and thinking, oh, they're a little bit behind, not realizing it was me. So lovely to see you all again. And hopefully you found the last session of some use to kind of help challenge the way that we think about what we do and how we do it. And this session is going to go into it, not so much the each model in a bit more depth, although I will mention that. It's going to be more about how HR works and the way in which we can change what we do to kind of help us be more impactful, more agile, more relevant, build our credibility. As obviously just to remind you, I will reference the each model and you'll see as we go through that I'm going to be talking about it in relation to how HR does what it does, not just the products and services that we provide, but the way that we work as a team. And I'm going to talk you through kind of the new HR team, the trends that we're seeing. I'm not just going to give you a load of skills and competencies. You know, I was reading something, I think it was Dave Ulrich the other day, and it was like, you know, there are 125 competencies that HR needs to have, which just makes me feel frankly exhausted and makes me just want to give up. I don't think there may be 125, but I think what I want to try and do is just to get you to focus on perhaps 4 areas that it might be worth you just reflecting and thinking, is this how I'm where I'm spending my time? Is this where my energy is going? Is this where I'm building my capabilities? Or actually, am I still acting as nursemaid, compliance officer, etc.? So let's kick off with the traditional HR team. And I just want to kind of make the point here that there's no higher moral ground here, all right? Everything I criticize, I have done. And, you know, I'm not standing here as some guru who's sort of saying, oh, you know, lecturing you. I think this is really tough. It's really tough to move away from the way that we've always done things. And there are some good reasons for why we've done it the way we've done it. But if we want to achieve that sense of professional satisfaction, if we really want to see that we're building our credibility, and if we really want to see that we are having a fantastic impact and relevance on the organisation, then I think these are some of the things that we need to kind of move away from. Yes, in answer to Sally's question, by the way, what I'm going to do is send both presentations over to the guys at HPMA immediately after we finish, so they'll be available for you. So we know that the traditional HR team has been largely driven by process. You know, the minute we think about something new, oh, we need to improve inclusivity. Let's get a process for it. We need to improve management capability. Let's get a process for it. And that process might include mandatory training programs. It might include cascade scripts and frequently asked questions, but it tends to be process-based, which we then roll out to the whole organization. And what I'm hoping I'm going to share with you as we go through is that actually that's not the most effective way of doing it. It may not be an effective way at all, and that there are different tools and techniques that we can use. I've already talked about parenting, so I'm not going to go into that. But it's amazing just how many of us, and again, I think myself included, derived our sense of value and our sense of self-esteem and the thought that we were doing a good job if we were parenting. So, you know, the amount of times I've been thanked by a manager, you know, I couldn't do it without you, Lucy. And I realized that actually all I've been doing is writing the notes up in a redundancy meeting, or I'm giving them the answer to everything. So all of that thing where we are the fountain of all knowledge, where we own everything, you know, the surveys are ours, the process is ours, anything where we're spoon feeding, doing it for them, rather than encouraging them to reflect and find ways that enable them to do it for themselves, I think is an issue. I'm going to talk about the fact that I think it's a problem for HR that we see ourselves as a service provider. You know, we talk about great service. And of course, you know, being, you know, great service is not a bad thing. But I think if we begin to change our mindsets and think about ourselves as product designers, more of this later, I think it takes us into a totally new and fresh space. Services tend to be consistently applied, streamlined processes, one size fits all. Whereas if we begin to think about ourselves as product designers, then we begin to think about the end user, we begin to think about marketing, we begin to think about choices, segmentation, and begin to bring in those marketing techniques that are incredibly valuable. Silos, I talked about the silos at the BBC, you know, the silos of television, online. But the truth is that HR was as siloed as they were. You know, we had our centres of expertise, we had our, and let's face it, 99% of us are still using the three-legged stool model of centre of expertise, shared services, and business partners. And, you know, when I had been a business partner, I was a divisional HR director at Serco for the rail side of the business. And I hated group. I hated group interfering, coming up with their wacky, ridiculous programs that they would then try and roll out across the whole organisation. And yeah, it used to drive me mad. And I used to try and keep them at arm's length, you know, protect my managers from Group HR. And then I became the Group HR Director for Serco. And of course, I went, poacher term gamekeeper. And then I was frustrated because the HR directors had all gone native, that horrible expression, they'd all gone native, and they weren't doing what I wanted them to do. And anyway, so we're as bad, aren't we? We also have, I think, the silo of the shared services function that, again, if we're honest, they are the poor relation of whether we've outsourced it and whether we've kept it in-house. They are still the poor relation. And what I would suggest is that the new HR team, and I'm not going to talk too much about this today, but the new HR team, if we think about the employee experience and we think about the moments that matter, that create that employee experience, then our shared services cover many of those. And if that's the case, why do we relegate them to the kind of poor relation? Why isn't shared services filled with very skilled, high judgment, capable of using high levels of judgment? Because we know that when a manager calls the helpline to find out about a policy, they don't really want to know about the policy. They want to know about getting round the policy, so we need people who are not just responding to the question that comes in, but are actually thinking, what's the precedent we're setting here? What's the backstory around this particular manager? Are they highly unionized? What's the capabilities within the team? What's the context? That's not just a yes, no answer, or this is the policy. So we do need to really think about the way that we elevate and build the capabilities within the shared service function and see them as a key member of the team that set that employee experience. Skills gaps, we know that 70-80% of our time is still highly transactional, highly operational. And then Ulrich came along and said to us, right, you're all strategic business partners now. Well, even when I was HR director of the BBC, I wasn't doing a totally strategic job. You're still going to get those operational queries. So I don't think it's about getting rid of that. It's about making it manageable and gradually over time, reducing the amount of time that we spend in operations, employee relations, and instead really thinking about building the capabilities of our managers and also then building our own capabilities in terms of the coaching, the influence, which we're going to come on to in a bit. And then, of course, we have our really clunky, heavy systems. We tend to think that we have to have one system that does everything for our people. And sorry, Jackie's just asked me a question. No, I'm not going to get people to break out. I'm just going to go with it with the live chat and try and answer some of the questions as we go along. And I'll leave some time for questions at the end, and I might pose a few myself. So I don't need breakout groups. So the one size technology, I think, we've kind of done these big HR transformation programs. We've ended up with things like Workday or SuccessFactors or other types of enterprise-wide systems that, my rule of thumb is if we have to train somebody to use it, then it's not good enough, because these systems should be completely intuitive. And whilst it's why we advocate a much greater use of apps rather than enterprise-wide web-based systems, because A, we need it to be mobile, and not all of these systems are. B, as human beings, we are completely capable of using multiple apps. In our human lives outside work, we use 9 different apps a day on average, and we typically use 30 different apps in a month. So we know that Google Maps is for finding where we want to go, and we know that Facebook is for talking to our friends. We don't have a problem with that. Almost it's better to have apps that do one or two things and make sure that they are brilliant and user-centric, rather than these huge, big enterprise-wide systems, which bring another problem, which is that we then take our broken processes and put them online and then tell managers that it's all self-service now, and then we get cross when they don't do it. In my experience, managers will typically use things that help them. And so it's a real question mark for us that they're not using them. So those are some of the things that we're seeing with the traditional HR team. So I want to take you through now what the new capabilities, the new areas of focus that we're seeing for HR. And they're these: insights, facilitation, influence, and design. So I'm going to take you through each of those. And again, if you've got any questions as we go along, I'm going to be keeping an eye on the chat section of this. So make sure that you're interacting as we go, and then we won't kind of leave it all to the end. So make it a bit more interactive. So in terms of insights, obviously we've got to have our insights into our business area or the area of the organization if we're a business partner that we're responsible for, and we should be as passionate about that as the people that are working in the front line. You know, when I was at the BBC, it amazed me when I first got there that in the HR area on the second floor in London, in the London office, there was no pictures of what we did. You know, we didn't have any pictures of Doctor Who or Blue Peter or the 10 o'clock news. And then I was talking to people who were in my team who were designing policies and process, who had never sat in a television gallery and watched a program go out, who had never been on the set of Luther. And so they were designing these things with no real sense of how this was going to operate in practice. And the truth was, some of them just weren't passionate about what the BBC does. Now, you work in an area like I did at the BBC, which is part of human life, and you know, it's hugely important. And so you've already got that. So I think we have to make more of it. If we start talking about them, they, as opposed to we, I think that becomes a problem. So of course we've got to have that, you know, relevant people insights in relation to our business area. But I would suggest there are a couple of other areas that we need to develop. In terms of our leaders, do we honestly know and understand their motivations for being leaders in the first place? If not, we need to find out, and we can do that through data collection, but primarily it's going to be through interviews and through discussion, where we will be able to get a sense of what are our people, our leaders' motivations. And the reason that that's important is that we very often launch stuff for our leaders without really thinking, why would they want to change the way they behave? Because if we don't get to that, then we get into mandatory training, we get into mandatory process compliance. I'll give you an example. So we had O2, so you'll be familiar with O2, and they were doing a rollout of their a new leadership behaviour program, new leadership behaviour framework. And they'd got things like, you know, must be agile and must have empathy and so on. And they were initially going to be doing a very standard rollout, which is communicate what these new behaviours are, and then do some training around it, and then do some communication around it and give examples. But we worked with them and we were saying, you know, why would these leaders want to adapt these behaviours? So instead we started to do something that I'll mention. In fact, I'll mention it now because I think this is a really cheap, effective and quick way of beginning to understand the motivations, the preferences of the people that work for you. And that's a technique called employee persona. Now, if you haven't come across employee persona before, this is a marketing technique that we've adapted for HR. So in marketing, you have things like customer persona, consumer persona. And what this does is that you identify, based on your broad demographics of your organization, you identify the types of people that work for you. I'm not talking about role or grade or job type. I'm talking about motivations for being there, preferences for learning, preferred communication style. And you begin to build up a number of persona that are fictional, but are rooted in reality. So when you look at these persona, you should be able to say, yeah, I work with that person. I know that person. the reason you use these persona, you give them a name, you give them a photograph off Google, not a real employee's photograph, is that it helps you think about the human beings who are at the end of your process, who are the people that you're doing stuff to. And it enables you to shape and reflect it by understanding what their motivations are, their preferences are. Sky, I want to talk about here as well, because they do some great stuff where they've said, we're not going to do huge amounts of leadership training. What we are going to do, though, is we're going to help our leaders understand their own capabilities, their own motivations, and we're going to help them understand the impact they have. Because the more we can do that, then the more they will be interested in doing stuff for themselves. Remember, trying to move away from compensating from the ones who are never going to be interested and never do anything in terms of building their capabilities and competence. Let's focus on the ones that actually might be interested if they had more insight. So how are you getting in touch with, in terms of developing insight into your leaders' motivations, their capabilities, their impact, because that will help you shape what you do. Similarly with your employees, and I mentioned persona types. If you go down the route of persona, and I think there's something on our website in the blog section about how to do it. If there isn't, there's definitely stuff on the club, on the Disruptive HR Club, is don't do more than 5 or 6. You know, I sometimes come across clients who have got these beautifully articulated design persona that actually are just in a drawer because there's too many of them and they're too complicated. Don't worry about them being perfect. Just give it a go. Get a group of you together and see if you could come up with between 4 and 6 persona for your organization, and start talking about Jackie or Matthew, these people with a backstory, when you've really got an understanding of what matters to them in terms of how they're recognized and rewarded, how they learn, how they want their career to develop, what their motivations are for being there. And then finally, on the insight, I think, you know, we need to ensure we're focusing on the impact of what we do, not whether we've got 98% compliance of our performance management system, but what's the impact that it's having. So an example of this, I think, is KPMG, who looked at, they wanted to look at how motivated people were after their performance management approach, not had they done it with dubious quality, but how motivated people were after it. And one of the things they found was that 75% of people had had the same rating for the last 5 years. And that really kind of gave them pause for thought about, is this worth bothering with, this kind of grading and rating? So let's think about the impact that we're having. So insight. And of course, this is data collection, but it's also enhancing that with qualitative research. So it's focus groups. One of the things that the co-op do is they have something called the colleague voice. And the colleague voice is voluntary, people coming together across the organization to help give feedback on HR services, but also to help create it. And we'll talk more, co-create them. We'll talk more about that in a bit. So the second area, I'm going to take a slurp of my coffee, bear with me. Second area that I think it's really important for us to focus on is the facilitation. And it sounds really passive and low impact facilitation, doesn't it? But great facilitation skills are hugely impactful and are actually quite rare. I don't think we invest enough in our ability in HR to do facilitation. This is not about a process, but this is about working with groups of leaders, groups of employees to help them do, as I've said there, to help them build their talent community. So we've got examples of, instead of a 9-box grid, we've got organizations like Western Union. And Western Union, what they did is that they facilitated groups of 10 to 12 managers, 1 hour a month. They called it Talking Talent. And it was just talk about the talent and the people in your team. No process, no forms, no assessment, no 9-box grid, no documentation, just talk. And they found this to be hugely powerful in terms of building the movement of talent across the organization, finding out about what other parts of the organizations were doing. And we've used this with our clients, used it with the Premier League, and it was just so useful, because instead of it being something that is a set piece once a year, your annual talent review, actually what you're doing is regularly just talking about it. And of course, it's a bit clumsy and a bit difficult at first, but they get loads better at it. Building a more inclusive culture. If we look at Bank of America, what they did was that they facilitated conversations, not a big inclusivity program, a big initiative. They just had what they called courageous conversations that were facilitated by HR. And this was an opportunity for people to talk about the things that small things that they found made them feel less included. So it could be about, you talking over me in a meeting. Small things. This is a kind of, again, a bigger trend. When I talked about human, this idea of micro inclusions or micro exclusions, these micro inequities, keeping it small, because a leader will feel much more comfortable about maybe changing that small bit of behavior than they will about having to change the whole diversity and inclusion of their whole organization. So facilitation, connecting your part of the business to the wider HR team. It's not our job to prevent divisional group HR from getting anywhere near us. It's about that facilitation, to opening our clients up to what L&D could do for them. To opening them up to the reward and recognition team. Again, leaders are very capable of having multiple points of contact. They just don't like it particularly, because we know that a lot of our centres of expertise don't speak their language. They are too process heavy. They don't get what they do. So we have to facilitate that if we're going to be truly collaborative and in our approach. And I mentioned ensuring that the colleague voice is heard, but also factored in. So facilitating things like, your colleague voice sessions, and ensuring that that's heard when you're designing new approaches. Now, influence kind of sounds a bit like facilitation, but actually it's more about the one-on-one. And we often moan in HR that we are not taken seriously, that we're not seen as credible, that we're not listened to. And that's led us to try and fight for a seat at the board or a seat at the senior table. And the advice I give when I'm coaching HR directors is, don't worry about that. Don't worry about that positional power. The key thing is how influential are you? And just having a seat at the board does not, by definition, make you more influential. We tend to think it does, because it's something that we're aiming for and we're seen as being in the gang. But actually, I think back to the BBC, one of the most, in fact, not the most influential person at the BBC on our chief executive was the head of communications, who specifically asked not to be included on the board. The way that he developed his approach in terms of being increasingly influential was about being really passionate and knowledgeable about the business. He was so knowledgeable in terms of he knew as much, if not more, than the program makers about the way that the media industry was going. He was hugely knowledgeable, incredibly well networked. We can increase our influence by increasing the amount of people that we know outside of our sector, outside of our own organization. People who are highly networked, that have those connections, that have those insights that come from those networks, are very interesting to our leaders. And so that's something I think we can really help with our credibility if we build that network. We build our influence if we're seen as having huge amounts of common sense, that we're able to use our judgment, that we don't just parrot back to people what the policy is or what we've been told. And I also mentioned, I think we increase our influence if we understand the motivations, if we develop our role and our influence as being the expert on people. Okay, final one, and then I'll just have a little pause and see whether people have got any questions. Now, you may not know it, but you are a product designer. All right, so start to think about yourself as a product designer. Not only does it feel much more sexy than an HR business partner or center of expertise, product designer's got a lovely ring to it. But if we begin to think about designing products, then it takes us down a very different path to the way that we've traditionally done things. So what do I mean by that? Well, first of all, we think about it being the things that we do being based around the insight and data that I've already talked about. So I'm not going to go into that. We think about co-creation. So instead of us thinking that we have to have all the ideas, we bring in particularly people from technology, agile product design. We bring in our managers and our end users and involve them. We make sure that we are getting a breadth of perspective rather than it just being the HR team, because we don't have the monopoly on good ideas. The trouble is that we often come at it when we're trying to do something new with an old framework. So let me give you an example of this. So we were working with a client who wanted to change their approach to performance management. And so they were asking their HR team and their employees, how could we do performance management? How could we do our performance management system in a different way? And they were quite disappointed with what was coming back. It was a bit pedestrian, it was a bit ordinary, and it wasn't wildly different to what they had. So they took a different approach and they said, what is it that we're trying to achieve? What should performance management lead to? What's the feeling that we want our people to have as a result of performance management? And they came up with the idea of it being lifted up. They wanted their people to feel lifted up. And that could be lifted up in terms of ambition, lifted up in terms of motivation, lifted up in terms of their ability to do something in a different way, so increasing their skills. But lifted up was really powerful. They took that back to the groups and said, how do we get our people to feel lifted up through the interactions that they have? And that led to a very different performance management approach than the one that they'd got previously. So maybe just framing the questions differently if you want to go into co-creation. I'm not going to go into the employee experience because unfortunately we don't have a huge amount of time, and that's a whole other workshop. But we do need to be thinking about how our people feel, not the processes that they're going to engage with, and then designing products that are around them, doing things for themselves. So LinkedIn are very good at this. It's about providing toolkits and frameworks. And I mentioned the whisper email from Google and, just getting them to take these things for themselves. That's not the same as putting all our big processes onto self-service and saying, right, it's over to you now, but actually finding ways that make it easy for them to use it. Giving them choices, different types of performance management approaches that they could choose from to find the one that's right for them. Does it need to be more team-based? Does it need to be more employee-owned? Does it need to be more tech-based? There are all sorts of ways that you can provide options. So, design. Now, I'm going to pause there and just see whether anybody's got any questions. And if you either want to type it in or if you want to raise your hand, I'm hoping that if you raise your hand, I'll be able to see it. I'm going to take a slurp of my coffee. Anybody got any questions or issues around this? No, I don't think so. Okay, let's carry on then. Hopefully it's all making sense.
Lucy.
Oh, right. Let me go back.
Somebody has their hand up. Christine has their hand up.
Chris, it hasn't. Oh, yeah. Okay. Sorry. Right. I'm just going to go on mute so you don't get the feedback.
Hi, thanks, Lucy. I really enjoyed the morning so far. I just wonder if you've got any experiences to share with us about how you've maybe worked differently with staff side. Because you mentioned the co-creating of products and designing stuff. Have you got any experience to share where that's worked differently? You're on mute, I think.
How many times a day do we say that? Sorry, was it about multiple sites? You're on mute now.
Yeah, I know. It's working with staff side organisations, so trade unions.
Right, trade unions. Yeah, sorry, yeah.
Yeah.
Very, very good point. And it can be very difficult, we know, because typically trade unions, in my experience, and I've worked with many, many different unions over the years, is that they tend to be quite enabling of that parental relationship. So they do tend to want to see that parenting. And so I think it can be tough. I think it also depends on the type of trade union reps you've got. You know, if you've got reps that are quite practical, transactional, then they can be easier. And I think you can typically get them to buy into piloting, trying something. They get nervous, obviously, if it's all a big rollout. But I think they can be quite supportive of just trying something if you've got a decent relationship with them. If you've got a relationship with them that is not positive, like I had with the National Union of Journalists, that were incredibly political, very angry, just said no to everything, then we tended to try and go directly to managers and pilot in a very small area. And to see whether things worked, and just to gradually get it to be that the employees were asking for it, rather than it being something that seemed to be coming from HR. So it does make life a lot trickier. What I would say is about these colleague voice sessions is that the co-op has a union. They have their staff reps, and the colleague voice is very different. So the agenda is deliberately different. They rotate, so they get new people on all the time. So you don't get this kind of standing army of people who end up representing the workforce. They bring in new people. They rotate a certain amount of the seats each time. And what they do is they focus them on co-creation. So in my experience, very often what would happen is I would take my ideas into the union meeting. They would take it and slag it off and pull it to pieces, and then I'd go away and I'd change it a bit, and then I'd bring it back, and then we'd argue. What you do in these co-creation sessions is there is no outcome that you've already pre-designed that you want them to get to. Because let's face it, we have done that on occasion, haven't we, where we pretended a bit that actually it's all up for grabs, and in fact it isn't. So what you do is that you genuinely go in with a more open approach, which is you set them a creative challenge, and you've got HR and employees and managers working together. One of the methods that we see around this is the idea of a hackathon, which is it doesn't drag on for many, many weeks or months. It's short, sharp. We see this being used in Ford. Obviously unionised. We've seen it being used in, what's the name of the bank? It's gone. The big German bank used it, not Deutsche Bank, another one. And in fact, Ford, I really Cisco it was. They did a hackathon, except they called it an HR breakathon. And what they did was they actually closed HR for 3 days, and they looked at really going into how could we do things differently. And it was a kind of rolling 3-day hackathon, which, needs to be facilitated, needs to be structured, but it's done quickly. It's not something that drags on for months and months and months in kind of consultation. So it's moving it out of that moving it out of the kind of traditional consultation mechanisms and doing it differently and in a fresher way. Now, I'm struggling to see if people have got their hands up. Oh, I see where the hand goes. It goes next to their name. Right, I've got that. I think that's all we've got for now. Let me move on because I'm conscious we've only got 15 minutes. So I'm going to whiz on. I mentioned we work with thousands of HR people every year, and these are typically the top 10 challenges that everybody faced. This came up as a question in the previous, I'll just go back so you can read them a bit more. And then this came up as a question, what are the key challenges? Typically when we ask people what are the key challenges they face, these are the ones that they come up with. So leadership management skills, overwhelmed by transactional demands and poor and outdated systems. I've touched a little bit on the systems, but very often that's out of our control. I think if we're still worrying about the impact of systems, then I think it comes back to what data and insights are we gathering? And if we are able to use more qualitative research to supplement and to question the value of a lot of the data that we're picking up, question mark, really, is churn, is staff turnover a hugely valuable insight? Or should we be doing more of the stay interviews where we're able to, instead of looking back after they've left, we're looking at providing insight and intelligence of how are our people feeling? What's the difference between the employer brand that they were attracted to during recruitment to their experience within their first few months? So again, there's some information, insights on stay interviews on the club. I just want to move on and just look at how we can work a bit differently. And I just wanted to share some of these things that we're seeing now, more of now since COVID, which again is, for all its sadness, this gives us, let's hope, a once in a lifetime chance to really change things. We've talked about this. It doesn't always have to be a process. That's our kind of first thought, but actually thinking about the outcomes that we want first of all. And I mentioned the performance management piece. So next time you go straight, you're talking about what do we do, and immediately a process comes up. I think, really challenging that and saying, actually, let's look at how the human brain works in this area. Let's look at trying something small, some small sort of tweak in behaviour, and rather than kind of looking at it always being a process, customising where you can. You can either customise at the organisational level. I gave the example of Starbucks, or customise at a manager level. So you're providing managers with a sense of how they can do things differently for different groups, different types. So stupid example, but right now we're spending our lives on these Zoom calls and virtual meetings. You might want to give your managers some insight about how best to do one of those sessions if they've got extroverts and introverts. So we know that extroverts actually have no problem putting their hand up and giving their views. And so actually we're not worrying about them. It's the introverts. And so something that Amazon do, that Square do, they have silent meetings. So the first 30 minutes will be a Google document that everybody's got. And then they spend the first 30 minutes annotating that document. So no one's speaking, no one's shouting over everybody else. The introverts aren't kind of running for cover, but instead they're able to contribute, and then the facilitator of that meeting will then take the comments that's on there. Those are the kind of insights that I think we need to be providing to our leaders, recognizing that one size, one standard approach is always going to lack relevance and lack impact. Now, sometimes I think we worry that if we differentiate, we're going to get into trouble around discrimination, and that we have to provide one size fits all to ensure that we're not discriminating. I think actually it's the opposite. I think what we need to be ensuring is that the experience our people have is the same. but the way we get to that experience can be very different. So, for example, if we want all our people to feel recognised and feel that they are being rewarded for what they do, that could look incredibly different depending on what matters to them. A great exercise to do is, if you're working with a group of leaders, is get them to talk about the best reward they've ever had at work. And what will come up will be money for some people, very rarely. But one guy, I've only ever had one guy mention that, and I was a bit disappointed because it kind of broke my record of never having anyone mention money. And then he said, but it was $1 million bonus. I was like, okay, fair enough, fair enough. So some might mention money, but most people will talk about that handwritten note that they got from somebody that they respect. They'll talk about the fact they got to go on that learning opportunity. They'll mention the fact that they got given the afternoon off because they'd worked some extra hours that week. So it will vary enormously. So if we're going to have our people feel rewarded and recognised, the consistent experience, then we have to find different ways and different choices. So it's not about saying you're in this persona, therefore you're only going to get this. That's not what I'm suggesting at all. I'm suggesting that what we ensure is that we're providing choice. We're providing options, but considered choices and options. What could you stop doing? I think it's perfect time now to reflect on the last 6-7 months and the things that you stopped doing during lockdown the first time round. And what did people cry out for? What did people actually miss? We're seeing all sorts of things happening that people have said, we've been pushing this process for years. We stopped doing it overnight and no one noticed, no one mentioned, no one called out for it. That's a massive insight. And I think, it might be that you still want some of the outcomes from that process that you were trying to achieve. But if nobody missed that process, if no manager said, you know what, I'm really missing my 9-box grid because I'm not sure who my talent is, then chances are that 9-box grid is not working for you. And I mentioned involving the wider network, particularly tech. I used to say tech and workplace, but that's kind of a bit mute at the moment. But quite often when we talk about creating experiences for our people, we need to be working hand in glove with our tech colleagues. And, we see quite often that HR are trying to be innovative. They're trying to be progressive. And then the technology side, whose rationale is protect the organization, will say, you can't use WhatsApp. You can't use Workplace by Facebook, all of these brilliant, intuitive and useful tools that actually would really help. Okay. Now I mentioned products. I'm going to bang on about it again very briefly. And please do write questions up if you've got them, because we've got another 10 minutes before we need to draw it to a close. I just think, in HR, if we produced widgets in HR and people weren't buying our widgets, our response wouldn't be, well, we must make them buy it. We must put them on mandatory training programs and make them do it. We would say there's something wrong with the widgets that we're producing. So why don't we do that with our services? We're having to force people to do it. Chances are it's because it's not intuitive. It's not helping them achieve what they want to achieve, or they don't care. Now, putting them on a training program doesn't make them care. So let's start thinking about ourselves as product designers. Let's start thinking about ourselves as designing around the end user first. What are their pain points? What are their motivations? And work back from that. Let's start thinking about having, like Apple does, only 1 or 2 products on the slate at any one time. Great company called Shop Direct, based up in Merseyside, and they plan in 3-month bursts. Have it in 3 months. Sorry, someone just said about I had a bad experience with trade unions. I've had good as well. I've had the whole range, the whole range I've had. I would call the NUJ was particularly bad, but I would also point to Bectu, being great. Even the RMT actually was great to work with, strangely, perhaps not we would imagine. Where was I going with this? Yeah, so the products, not services. So marketing, thinking about the end users, their pain points, the design, and only having one or two on the slate at any one time, like Apple. Planning in short bursts. Why do we have to have 3-month strategic plans in HR? 1-year business plans? It doesn't make any sense. We can't predict that far ahead. My sister works in the NHS. She's a nurse in Charing Cross Hospital. She's a team leader, and she's saying that she's having to do these plans for her team, and it's a different one every week. So the idea that we would have these kind of 12-month horizons right now is just pointless. Have a sense of where you want to go, but then plan in these short bursts. Makes you more responsive, makes you more focused, makes you more credible. It also doesn't have to be perfect. You know, we don't have to, before we launch something, have the frequently asked questions and the scripts for managers and everything sorted. We're seeing more and more HR teams going, you know, actually, it's about progress, not perfection. Let's put something out there. We'll tell them that it's not 100% yet, but get their feedback. Let's just get their feedback on it. IBM did something interesting with their performance management approach. They wanted to change it. They didn't roll it out when it was perfect. They just put a little video out that showed what it might look like. And then what came back, they were able to amend and adapt. So just thinking about this idea of what's the smallest amount of product you could get away with putting out there to enable you to get feedback so you can iterate and you can continue to build on it. And then, you know, I think sometimes we say, well, managers won't do this. Managers don't do it. Managers won't do that. And I think, so we have to do it for them. And I think, you know, we've got to recognize, obviously, we can't suddenly expect managers to change overnight. You know, I use the example of, you know, if you've got stabilizer wheels on your kid's bike, you wouldn't take the stabilizer wheels off immediately and kind of push them and wave goodbye. That would be negligent parenting. But neither would you keep the stabilizer wheels on until they were in their 30s. You would see your role as being to get them to do it for themselves. So what are the tools, the frameworks, intuitive, easy, small, little tips, hints, that we can gradually move our managers there? And there's a technique called scaffolding that you might have heard about, where you kind of, I'll give you an example. It's the only way I can explain it really. Scaffolding is about helping managers to try something new, but in a safe environment, so that if it goes wrong, nobody gets hurt. So we were working with a group of managers that were working for an engineering firm, and we wanted them to be responsible for allocating pay decisions and bonus decisions. We weren't going to give them the budget overnight, so we started off with a theoretical group of employees, gave them a bit of budget, theoretical budget, and gave them a backstory on each of the employees. And then they had a go, and then we asked them how they'd got on, share their thinking. We then challenged some of their thinking and said, but, you know, what are you going to do if they're not happy? What are you going to do if they cry? What are you going to do if they get angry? And coach them. And then eventually we moved them to a place where they've got a real budget for a small number of people, same thing again. And finally, until they then took over the entire budget and freed HR's time up to do the important stuff, which is about helping them really think through how they might use their budget effectively, and what, giving them insights into what really motivates their people, rather than processing the payments and getting all of that done. So I think that, you know, we need to kind of have our focus as about how can we help managers doing it for themselves. Final points, and then we'll wrap up unless anyone's got any questions. You know, we tend to design in HR for the worst behaving employees and the best behaving employees. We focus on our high potential programs, top talent, and then we focus on the ones who are going to behave badly. But what about if we design for the people in the middle? Not the bad people, not the good people, to use very judgmental terms, but just the normal people, the average people. And I think, you know, it would drive us to do things very differently. A classic example would be Virgin Atlantic. You know, they looked at their probation periods and they said, how many people actually fail our probation period? Which in itself is an incredibly It's like a criminal, isn't it? Probation period. What they looked at was that two people out of their 10,000 staff failed their probation period each year. They said, so why are we doing it? Let's drop it. And they dropped their probation period. Because that's designing around the worst behaving people. That's designing a probation period because we don't want to expose our organisation to the people who aren't going to work out. But actually, what are we doing to the ones, the vast majority who are working out? And instead, they reframed it. I can't remember whether it was a settling in period or a getting to know you period, and just framed it in a very different way, but without this punitive drop dead date, you know, with the sword of Damocles hanging over. And then I talked about this earlier, which is thinking about us as a pull strategy through attraction rather than rollout, group-wide implementation, mandatory training. Instead, really thinking about how we can attract by working with managers where there's some energy, celebrating them, talking about what they do, promoting what they do. I spent so much of my life working with managers who weren't going to change, diluting what we were going to do, compromising what we were going to do. And actually, I think if we work with those people that might get it, that might be interested, I think we will find it much more energizing for ourselves. We'll achieve much more. Just looking, Sally's saying pull push, very similar in schools, with focus on more able and talented and those at risk being disengaging, very little for those normal achievers, resulting them feeling invisible and valued. And yeah, I think that's absolutely right. You know, the idea that we would have a high potential program, what is that saying to everybody? And equally, we know that potential is contextual, but that's a whole other talk. Right. Look, I hope that this has been of value. I'll just whiz through these final things. So, you know, what we're talking about here, and you'll get these slides, and I'm just conscious of time, so I'm going to whiz through these and you can read them for yourselves. What does HR look like if we're behaving like an adult to adult? What does it look like if we're creating that adult to adult dynamic? I'm not going to read them out. Again, you're adults, you can read it for yourself. What does consumer look like? Again, you can read that. I'm just having a look at some of the questions. And finally, human. What does human look like? So Anne makes the point about mandatory training, some being useful and some not. And I think for me, it's less about what is useful and what's not, and more what is that we just can't get away from mandatory, because the risk of one person not doing it, either in terms of health and safety or regulatory issues or reputational issues, I think actually, you know, unfortunately, we have to take that more parental approach. But I don't think we should kid ourselves that anything mandatory is necessarily going to be hugely effective. Useful, essential. I think that sometimes it just is. But if we reduce that down to those areas where it is absolutely essential that we just have to tick the box, then I think actually our people forgive us more and are more accommodating if we're not making it our go-to position. Right. Has anybody got any final questions? I think we might be at the end of the session. Thank you for your questions as you've gone along. I hope you found that of use. And you've got the website there. There's loads more free resources for you there if you'd like them. Jackie, am I handing back to you? And I'm sorry I missed the first minute by being in the wrong room.
I'm handing back to Wendy. Wendy, we can't hear you. Sorry, hold on. It would appear Wendy has some sound issues there. You are live, Wendy. Have you got your mic turned off your end? Can you turn your mic on? Oh, well, I'm so sorry that we can't hear Wendy. I would just like on Wendy's behalf, Lucy, to thank you very, very much for today, for the plenary session as well as the workshop. It's been absolutely fascinating to hear your experiences and some really valuable learning there, as we can see from some of the comments in the earlier plenary session as well as this workshop session. So thank you so much.
It's been my pleasure. Have a great rest of the day, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy.
Thank you.
Oh. So sorry, Wendy. I don't know what happened there. Wendy, do you want to stay on the line and we'll sort that out? Okay, as people leave. Wendy, can you hear me? No, I can't hear you. I can't hear you. You might want to type in chat. Hang on. Let me just